The silence settled like a verdict. You sat there, chest tight, watching the pieces of your life scattered across someone else's chessboard, betrayed by the one you believed would never lift a finger against you. In that moment, the mirror offered no comfort. It reflected a version of you who swallowed every insult, who begged for scraps of respect, who traded your dignity for a whisper of approval. You felt small, stripped of momentum, and yet something brutal stirred beneath the ache. A clarity so cold it cut through every excuse you told yourself. You remember the taste of it: denial, seasoned with the hollow shame of each apology you never deserved. They said you were too sensitive, too kind, too predictable, but the wound wasn't in being gentle. It was in trading your power for their opinion. Now, the memory of your own voice trembling feels like a relic you can't ignore. That fracture, when you stopped seeing yourself as the victim, became the hinge on which your entire world would turn. There's a paradox here. The very moment you felt most diminished, you were closest to your first breath of real authority. In the echo of betrayal, you heard the faint pulse of possibility. But this moment demands more than hope. It demands confrontation. You won't be comforted by "you deserve better." You won't be guided by someone else's blueprint for worth. You will steel yourself in observation. Watch how they lean in when you retreat, how they smile at your silence, how they bend to your absence. Let each reaction carve into your bones the lesson they never taught you: that power doesn't ask. Power commands. If this cuts too deep, good. If it leaves a mark you can't wash off, even better. Because beneath that mark lies the cornerstone of your unshakable self. Listen to the stillness that follows the storm of insult. In that void, you will find the code of your own becoming. And when you do, you won't need affirmation, only awareness. Subscribe or comment if you recognize the feeling of breaking open, and decide now to never seal yourself up again. You learned to sit still long before the world taught you how to move. When they shoved you into corners, familial gatherings where old ghosts resurfaced, boardrooms where pedigrees mattered more than performance, you discovered the edge of your own patience. That moment when voices clamor for your attention, demanding an apology or an explanation, you recognized something vital. Silence is a weapon more precise than any tongue. You felt the weight of their stares, heard the hum of expectation as you held your breath. In that unspoken vacuum, you were not absent, you were conspicuously powerful. Every second you refused to break, you carved their uncertainty into the air. They flinched at your calm, suspected strength where they expected weakness. And in that suspicion, you found your first advantage. You carried each betrayal like a ledger of debts unpaid, not to balance the score, but to remember the currency of leverage. When they belittled your dreams, you listed their dismissals in the vault of your mind, each slight a stone you'd later use to build an unassailable fortress. They apologized once, twice, then stopped counting, assuming you'd accepted their control. But you never did. You catalogued their patterns of evasion, their feeble attempts at manipulation, until the memory of their tactics burned hotter than any apology could cool. And in that heat, you forged a new instinct: to watch for the slight twitch at the corner of the eye, the tremor beneath the practiced calm. You learned that emotional predators always give themselves away. Never trust the words, trust the crack in their armor. There's a hidden language in absence. When you stopped defending yourself, they started doubting themselves. You recall the last time you walked away, shoulders straight, chest empty of pleading, the room convulsed with questions you'd never answer. Where did he go? Why such coldness? Who raised you to speak only when spoken to? They circled back, offering concessions they never intended to keep, but the concession was never yours. It belonged to the space you vacated. Power resides not in the grand gesture, but in the simple gesture of stepping out of the frame. You became a rumor in their conversation, an unspoken threat at every table. Control slipped through their fingers like ash, because you refused to play their net. Inside you hid a paradox, the desire to be known, and the fear of being conquered. You recognized that craving approval was your most exploitable fracture. Every compliment you chased planted a nail in your own coffin. You saw them smiling at your eagerness, tasting your desperation. Then one day, you tasted it too and spat it out. Let them admire from afar. Let them theorize about the source of your quiet fire. They would build myths around your restraint, weaving fairy tales of some moral high ground you'd never claimed. And as they spun their fantasies, you stood untouched at the center, free from the chaos they traded for certainty. They labeled you indifferent when you refused to perform. The accusation felt like a medal. Better to be called cold than to be called tender to every whim. You felt the sting of their judgment, but it slid off your skin, impotent. They couldn't grasp that detachment is not apathy, but sovereignty. You grasped the steering wheel of your own emotions, guided every turn with deliberate ease. They mistook your stillness for emptiness. They hadn't yet learned that an empty vessel echoes the deepest forces. You carried storms beneath your calm, and you whispered thunder in their unguarded moments. Remember the last clash, the final argument you walked away from without a backward glance. You saw in their eyes the flicker of regret, finally facing the cost of underestimating you. They replayed every misstep, every time they tried to shame you into submission. You felt the tremor in their spine when they realized respect isn't granted, it's appropriated. You let them unravel in their own minds, untangling the thread of your resistance until they understood. The only apology that matters is the one you refuse to accept. Now, as you listen to the echo of your own heartbeat, you'll notice a new rhythm, one that no one can dictate. You will feel the echo of their unease, knowing that every glance they cast your way is laced with the question, what is he thinking? And in that question lies your command. They chase after every clue, desperate for a crack in your armor. But you remain unreadable, a puzzle they can't solve, a force they can't harness. You watch them scramble for control, as if your every move was a fissure widening beneath their feet. They spoke in measured tones, offering reasoning dipped in honey but coated in authority. You let their words float past, like smoke drifting upward, visible, tangible, and utterly dismissed. In that moment, you understood that real power doesn't respond, it redirects. When they pressed with another question, you tilted your head and exhaled the silence they couldn't fill. Their discomfort became your signal. You were no longer prey, but the apex of the room. They remember you by absence before presence. When you withdrew from their games, no accusations, no rebuttals, their entire world reeled. You became the void at the center of their calculation, the margin of error they never accounted for. They tried to map your territory, to set boundaries around your convictions, but boundaries exist to imprison, and you refused to contain yourself. Every retreat was a redefinition of your domain, every withheld word a statement of ownership over your psyche. Betrayal taught you the geometry of emotion angles and margins where they thought you would bleed. You catalogued every infraction, the question veiled in concern, the suggestion borrowed from someone else's playbook, the compliment laced with contempt. You stored them away, not to fester, but to illuminate. In the quiet moments, your mind replayed each scene, stripping away the narrative the betrayer wanted you to believe. You saw them naked, their agendas, their envy, their fear, and you learned not to pity the blind, but to respect the vision you found in yourself. There is a ritual in detachment. First comes recognition, naming the tension between who you were and who you allowed them to make you. Then comes refusal, the instant decision not to negotiate your dignity. Finally arrives the recalibration, the steady course correction toward unshakable self-possession. You practiced it in stolen minutes during the lull at work, in the static between phone calls, in the hollow spaces of all those unsent messages. Each act of conscious withdrawal molded you into someone they couldn't predict, someone they couldn't own. You felt them testing your boundaries, probing for any sign that you still needed their approval. They asked for your time, your trust, your silence, thinking you were still the pliable version of yourself. But you had already traded your dependency for autonomy. You sensed the shift in their tone when you began speaking only to the point, not to the appeal. They hesitated, searching for the familiar craving in your eyes. Finding none, they recoiled, uncertain where to strike next. And that hesitation was your victory, a fracture in their dominance. You could exploit again and again. In every room you occupy, you carry an unspoken rule. You answer only when it serves you. They will misinterpret this as arrogance or indifference. Let them. Misjudgment is the mask of the uninformed. To wield power, you must embrace their misreading of you. In the space between what they think they know and what you choose to reveal, you hold the reins. Their assumptions become your camouflage, their impatience your ally. Always remember, they cannot penetrate a fortress they cannot see. Look back at the wreckage of conversations you abandoned, texts left unread, meetings you left early, conversations you deflected. Those weren't failures, they were crucibles. Each moment you spared your energy from their demands. You reinforced the walls of your resolve. They thought they were shaping you. You were sculpting yourself against their chisels. Your form emerged, hardened, defined by the absence of their influence. In their frustration, they called you coal. In truth, you were simply untouchable. Now, close your eyes and feel the tremor in your own pulse, the steady cadence of someone who has reclaimed every fragment of self they once surrendered. This rhythm will guide you through every strategy they deploy, every attempt to derail your equilibrium. They will build narratives around your silence, but that only amplifies your presence. You have become the question they cannot answer, the silence they cannot fill, the power they cannot replicate. They told you strength is loud. They labeled your quiet as fear, your reserve as weakness. Yet every thunderous display they offered was hollow, an echo of insecurity. You realized true force is restrained. In a crowded bar lit by neon and false cheer, you watched the alpha bristle at your calm. His voice climbed, volume masking doubt. You sipped your drink, measured the weight of his presence, and in a single blink, you dismantled his performance. The silence you offered in return forced him to fill the void with stammering bravado. That moment crystallized your mastery. You would never compete in their arena of noise. You would win by withholding the one thing they craved most: reaction. In every betrayal you've carried, there was a lesson hidden beneath the sting. You learned that sorrow and rage are twin currencies of emotional bankruptcy spent too freely. They leave you indebted to chaos, so you buried them, not in denial, but in strategic concealment. When you last encountered the person who stole your trust, you met their apology with a nod so slight it could have passed unnoticed. Yet it reverberated through the space between you, louder than any apology you ever gave. They bristled, finally understanding that regret offered without reckoning is a disarmed weapon. You had taken their ammunition and repurposed it, turning their guilt into a monument of your uninvested attachment. Power speaks in small gestures. A deliberate pause before you answer. Enough time for them to taste anticipation. The slow lift of an eyebrow. An imperceptible shift in posture. You trained yourself to be minimal in expression because extravagance broadcasts intention. You watched them scanning your face, hunting for clues, only to find the same mask of measured detachment. Their frustration became your echo chamber. You learned to calibrate every movement with the precision of a surgeon, incisions so fine they leave no scar, no trace of the blow, only the knowledge that you decided where it landed. There is a lineage to emotional dominance, an inheritance you claim by observing predator and prey. Every conversation where you once followed their rhythm, you now determine the tempo. You listen to their heartbeat in words, detect the tremor in possibilities. Then you alter the cadence, shifting their balance until they march to your internal drum. They call it manipulation. You call it sovereignty. In the boardroom, when a rival launched his tactic, a feigned concession to draw you in, you played along, acknowledging his move with a curt nod. But your acceptance was a trap. In the next exchange, you seized control of the dialogue, turning his concession against him until he begged to retreat. Power, you learned, isn't taken, it's offered and then appropriated. In the aftermath of each clash, you examine the debris not to reconstruct what was lost, but to blueprint what you will become. You dissect the contours of their aggression, isolate the moment their strategy faltered. You study the pattern of their breathing, the flicker of muscle, the trajectory of their gaze. Then you integrate it, not as an echo, but as a weapon you wielded before they realized they presented it. Your mind became a gallery of their failures. Each exhibited lesson, a reminder of how far you've evolved beyond their gravity. There is a ritual in every encounter. You arrive unannounced, unimpressed, unbowed. You depart without explanation, unclaimed by their narrative. In between, you navigate layers of pretense, peeling back the masks they insist on wearing. You do not smile to appease. You do not frown to threaten, you observe. You respond with the currency of absence, and in the rare moments you speak, your words are iron. They land with impact because they are few. They carry the weight of someone who knows silence is never empty. Their envy is the compass that tracks your ascent. Notice how they mimic your restraint, how they attempt to silence themselves to match your quiet strength. They think replication yields mastery. They learn too late that imitation is the most transparent form of flattery. In their pale recreations, they reveal their own void. You stand apart because your stillness is earned, not performed. You claim space they cannot occupy, and in that unshared territory, you build your empire. On nights when the world feels too bright, when every voice demands concession, you retreat inward. There, you confront the ghost of who you were pleading, chasing, fearing. You greet that ghost not with pity, but with recognition. This was your apprenticeship. You extinguish the ember of old weakness and let the darkness serve you. In the black, you learn clarity. In the void, you find gravity. Now, imagine the next time someone tests you. Feel the tension coil in their chest as you remain unreadable. See their hand tremble before the question. Feel the shift in the air as they realize they're negotiating with a fortress. You will never apologize for your calm. You will never explain your silence, because in that withholding, you wield the primal instinct they cannot override. The instinct to respect the unknown. There is a moment when you realize you no longer bristle at every slight, that you've transcended the reflex to react. You first noticed it in yourself on a rainy Thursday. Waiting for the subway, a stranger brushed past, whispered sorry almost mechanically. In the past, that would have triggered a spiral of overthinking. What did I do wrong? Was there contempt in their tone? But this time, you felt nothing. You observed the apology as you would watch raindrops race along the window, detached, curious, uninvested. You understood in that instant that your equilibrium had become autonomous. It no longer depended on consent or contrition. It existed because you chose it. Minute by minute, they hunt for vulnerability like predators sniffing blood in the water. But you have learned to bleed on your own terms. Recall the last negotiation where they pressed you for extra work, trotted out every half-truth they believed would bait you into guilt. You leaned back, fixed your gaze on the ceiling, and offered a single word: considered. It was neither yes nor no. It was calculus. They recoiled, powerless to interpret your stance, paralyzed in the space between compliance and refusal. That one syllable ended the transaction. They had nothing left to negotiate once you refused to wear the mask of eagerness. In the theater of influence, volume is a liability. You discovered this when your rival launched a smear campaign email circulated behind your back. Whispered rumors in the corridors. Colleagues asked if you'd heard the news, eyes dancing with schadenfreude. You remained silent, unflinching, unaddressed. Eventually, the rumormongers ran out of steam. They had nobody to feed their story. Their narrative collapsed in on itself because it required your reaction to sustain it. Silence voids their gossip. Absence starves their lies. Every wound you carry became an asset. You turned resentment into a blueprint for detachment. When someone insulted your competence, you pictured their words as etchings on steel too shallow to penetrate the surface. You learned that contempt, when met with calm, echoes back to the sender with amplified shame. They aren't offended by your silence. They're infuriated by your indifference. And that fury reveals their true weakness: dependency on your emotional currency. Now, in every room you enter, you radiate the stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove. You measure interactions by their utility, not their comfort. You listen for the gap between proposal and promise, for the tremor when they realize their leverage slipped from your grasp. You respond only when it serves your purpose, and you withhold precisely when it yields the greatest impact. They see you as unreadable, as a constant they cannot calculate. In that unreadability, you hold the summit of power. The final truth you must embrace is this: respect isn't a gift. It's the residue left behind when someone collides with your unbroken center. They will assume you favor them when you remain unmoved. They will seek your reaction as if it were a currency you issue. And when you resist, you command their attention in a way no concession ever could. The final reckoning isn't in what they say, but in what you refuse to supply. In every encounter, you've offered only the angles that fortify your sovereignty. A measured nod instead of an apology, a calculated pause instead of an explanation, a single word that distills the conversation to its rawest terms. You've traded the currency of reaction for the capital of absence, and watched their influence dissolve in your silence. Now, understand this: the world will still demand your explanation, your concession, your display of vulnerability. Let them circle, let them clamor. Their need to see you crumble is the last lifeline they cling to. You don't owe them your collapse. No chorus of pleas, no parade of regrets. Your value is not licensed by their approval. It's encoded in the void you leave behind when you disengage. Respect arrives not as a favor, but as the residue of collision with your unbroken center. So continue to answer only when it serves you, and withhold when it hauls them toward uncertainty. Let their frustration become the echo of your unassailable calm. This is the closing lesson. Power is not seized in grand gestures, but in the disciplined restraint you apply to every moment. It is the stillness that stuns, the absence that unsettles, the precision that leaves no scars. You've become the force they can't map or mimic, the silence they can't fill. Subscribe or comment if you feel the gravity of your own emergence, and step away from the noise, knowing your true command lies in the space you leave unspoken.